The summer I turned 32, I was fixing a section of cedar rail fence along the east side of my property when my neighbor's daughter came home. I didn't know she was back. I hadn't seen her in maybe 4 years, not since before her mother passed and she'd taken a position teaching elementary school in Kelowna. I was just working, the way you do, when there's nothing else that needs your attention more urgently. Driving posts, resetting the top rail, sweating through my shirt in that particular way July and the Okanagan demands of you. The kind of work that empties your head. I heard a car door, then another, then nothing for a while. My place sits on about 60 acres outside of Karemios, a small town in the southern interior of British Columbia that most people drive through without stopping. There's a main street with a post office, a hardware store, a diner called Paulette's that's been there longer than anyone can remember, and a little Legion Hall that gets busy on Friday evenings. The orchards start just past the edge of town and roll on for miles. Peaches, cherries, apples, pears depending on the season. I run a small operation. Stone fruit, mainly. A few rows of Honeycrisp I put in 3 years ago that are just starting to prove themselves. I do all right. I'm not the kind of person who needs a lot. I'd inherited the property from my Uncle Douglas when I was 26, and I'd spent the years since then learning it. Learning what it wanted, what it could give, what it needed from me in return. It was a fair trade. The land was patient. So was I. The Hartley place sat directly east, separated from mine by that cedar fence and about 40 meters of dry summer grass. Tom Hartley had farmed apricots there for decades, and after he died, his wife Margaret kept it going with the help of their son until Margaret passed too, about 3 years back. I'd gone to both services. Tom's had been a big crowd. Margaret's had been smaller. Most of the old-timers had gone by then. After that, the property sat mostly quiet. The son, Warren, didn't farm it. He came out occasionally to check on things, keep the irrigation running, make sure the house didn't fall apart. And from what I understood, the daughter, Sylvie, had her life somewhere else. Until she didn't. I found out she was back the way you find out most things in a small town, which is by seeing it yourself before anyone tells you. I looked up from the fence post I was tamping, and there she was, about 30 meters away, pulling a cardboard box out of the back of a dusty Subaru and carrying it toward the house. She walked like someone who knew where she was going, even if she wasn't sure she wanted to go there. Steady. A little tired around the shoulders. I went back to my work. About 20 minutes later, she came out again, and this time she stopped at the edge of the property and looked at what I was doing. I noticed because the movement caught my eye. I didn't say anything right away. Sometimes people just want to watch something get done. There's a comfort in it. "You're resetting all of it?" she said eventually. "Just the east section." Bottom rails were rotting. She nodded like that was a reasonable answer to a reasonable question. "Sylvie Hartley," she said in the manner of someone who'd introduced herself 1,000 times and had no illusions about whether I recognized her. "I know," I said. "I'm Gabe Moreau, from next door." "I know," she said, the same way I had. There was a small pause. The kind that isn't awkward, just honest. "You staying?" I asked. "For a while," she said, trying to figure out what while means. I nodded and went back to the fence. She went back to the car. The next week she was there every day, and slowly the Hartley place started looking like someone lived in it again. Curtains opened. The irrigation got adjusted. A pot of something appeared on the porch railing one evening, and I could smell it from my driveway. Herbs, I thought, maybe basil, the kind of green-specific smell that meant a garden was getting started. I left her alone. People who are figuring something out don't always want company. I understood that from my own first years on the property. The solitude had felt necessary before it felt chosen, but the fence ran between our properties, and fences need tending, and so there were moments. She was hanging laundry on the line her mother had strung between two poplars when I came by to check the gate latch one morning. Not close, maybe 15 meters. But the property opens up there and there's nothing much between you and whoever else is around. "Gate's stiff," I said, not really to her, just out loud. "Dad never oiled anything," she said, not looking up from the sheet she was pinning. It was a point of pride with him somehow. I laughed before I could stop myself. She glanced over and almost smiled. "You knew him," she said. "A little. He used to come over when I first moved in. Make sure I wasn't doing anything catastrophic with the irrigation schedule." "That sounds like him. He meant well. He always meant well," she said, and the way she said it wasn't bitter, just accurate. The kind of accounting you do when you've had enough time to stop being angry and start just seeing clearly. I oiled the gate latch and left. It was Paulette's where things shifted, though not in the dramatic way you might expect. It was a Tuesday in August, and I'd come in for coffee after driving to Penticton and back for a parts order, and Sylvie was at the counter with a mug in front of her and a book face down on the stool beside her, which is the universal signal for, I am alone by choice, but I wouldn't object to company. I sat 2 stools down, which is the universal response to that signal. Moreau, she said, without looking up from whatever she was reading on her phone. Hartley, I said. Paulette brought me a coffee without me asking, the way she does for everyone who comes in more than twice a month. We didn't talk for a few minutes. The diner was quiet. A fan moved the air around near the window. Someone had left a simulcamine spotlight on the counter, and I looked at the headline without really reading it. Then Sylvie said, "Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you actually like it here? Or is it just what you ended up with?" I thought about that for a moment, not because it was a hard question, but because it was a real one, and it deserved a real answer. "Both maybe," I said, at the start, but now it's the first thing. She looked at me then, directly, the way she had over the fence that first day. "I'm trying to figure out if it can be that for me," she said. "If that's even possible after everything." "What's the everything?" She picked up her mug. "A relationship that ended badly. A job I liked but couldn't keep liking. The feeling that I kept choosing things that looked right from the outside. And now, I'm 31 and living in my parents' house, and I'm not sure if that's a failure or a reset." I drank my coffee. Outside, someone's truck idled past on the main street. My Uncle Douglas used to say that the difference between a failure and a detour is mostly just the story you tell about it after, I said. She considered that. "Smart man." He was. Ornery too, but smart. She almost smiled again. I was starting to learn that almost was its own kind of currency with Sylvie Hartley, and it was worth more than the full version from most people. After that, we talked when we happened to be in the same place. The farmer's market on Saturday mornings, where she'd started selling preserves her mother had taught her to make. Peach, apricot, a cherry one, with a little bit of heat that people kept coming back for. Paulette's maybe once a week, the gas station twice, which made us both laugh, because Caramillo's has exactly one gas station, and running into someone there doesn't really count as coincidence. I noticed things without meaning to, the way she remembered names. Not just people's names, but what they'd told her last time, what their kids were doing, whether the thing they'd been worried about had worked out. The elementary school in town had posted on their Facebook page that they were looking for a long-term substitute, and I saw Sylvie's name in the comments, heard from Don Svensson at the hardware store that she'd been in to ask about the process, watched from a careful distance as she seemed to be deciding. And I noticed the things she did that had nothing to do with me, and no audience at all. How she kept her parents' garden going, even though it was work on top of work. How she showed up at the Legion Seniors Lunch on the 3rd Thursday of the month to help serve. I knew because Edna Chambers mentioned it when I was picking up my mail, and Edna mentions everything eventually. How she drove old Frank Arsenault to his medical appointments in Penticton because Frank's eyesight had gotten bad, and his family was in Calgary, and the drive is an hour each way. Nobody asked her to do any of that. She just did it. There's a kind of character assessment you can only make through observation over time, and I was doing it without quite admitting to myself that I was doing it. One evening in late August, I was on my porch after dinner, the light going gold over the orchard the way it does in that last hour before it drops behind the ridge, and I could see the lights on in the Hartley kitchen across the property. The window was open, and I could hear music, faint, something I didn't recognize. And I sat with that for a while, the lights, the music, the sound of the trees settling in the evening air. I hadn't felt that kind of pull towards someone in a long time. Maybe since before I'd moved out here, when I was living in Kamloops and working at my cousin's automotive shop and existing rather than living. I'd thought, when I came to the Okanagan, that maybe I'd traded one kind of loneliness for another, a quieter version, prettier scenery. And for a while that had been true. I wasn't sure when it stopped being true. I was pretty sure it had something to do with Sylvie Hartley's kitchen light being on across the field. The September long weekend, there was a harvest social at the community hall, a Caramillo's tradition, the kind of event that's been happening so long no one remembers who started it. People brought food. There was a fiddle player named Claude Bergeron who drove down from Oliver every year and was about 80 years old and played like he'd made a deal with someone. The kids ran outside until it got dark. The older folks sat in folding chairs along the wall and watched everything with the serene satisfaction of people who have nothing left to prove. Sylvie came with her brother Warren and his wife. I was there with my neighbor Pete Varga, who farms peaches a mile east, and has the conversational stamina of a man who's been waiting his whole life for someone to ask him about irrigation efficiency. I left Pete explaining subsurface drip systems to someone's teenage son and found a spot near the food table. Sylvie appeared beside me about 10 minutes later. "Your neighbor's been talking about irrigation for 20 minutes, she said quietly. "He's passionate," I said. "I heard the word evapotranspiration 4 times. He's very passionate." She picked up a piece of her own cherry preserve on a cracker and ate it with the matter-of-fact expression of someone conducting quality control. "Acceptable," she said. "High praise? From me, yes." We stood there and watched Claude Bergeron play something fast that got 3 couples out onto the floor, and the mood of the whole room lifted about 10 degrees. "I like it here," Sylvie said, and I don't think she was talking about the hall. "Yeah," I said. "I know what you mean." There was a pause. Claude Bergeron switched to something slower. One of the older couples near us got up to dance. Must have been in their 70s, moving together with the easy economy of people who've been doing this for decades. No wasted motion, just comfortable certainty. "I'm going to take the job," Sylvie said. "The teaching position. I heard you were considering it." "How?" "Don Svensson." She looked sideways at me. "Of course! He means well." "Everyone here means well," she said, but the way she said it was different from how she'd said the same thing about her father. Warmer. More like something she was still getting used to. I looked at her profile for a second, just a second, and then back at the dance floor. "I'm glad you're staying," I said. I kept my voice level. Informational. Not a declaration, just a fact. She was quiet for a moment. "Gabe," she said. "Yeah, I've noticed that you notice things." I wasn't sure what to do with that exactly, so I just said, "Comes with the territory. You pay attention to your land, you start paying attention to everything." She turned to look at me properly. "I've been paying attention too," she said, "in case that matters." It mattered, but neither of us moved fast. That wasn't who we were. Through September and into October, the harvest consuming most of my waking hours, we moved toward each other in the slow measured way of people who've been burned before and aren't interested in performing certainty they don't feel yet. She brought me a jar of the cherry preserve one morning, left it on my gatepost with no note. I left a box of Honeycrisps on hers a few days later. It sounds small. It wasn't. We started walking, not planned. Just the sort of thing that happens when 2 people are often outside at the same hours, and their properties are adjacent, and there's a gravel road along the ridge that's good at that time of year when the aspens are turning. She'd find me checking the irrigation one evening, and we'd both end up on that road without anyone having suggested it, talking about the things people talk about when they're deciding whether they trust each other. Her years in Kelowna, the good parts, and the parts that had hollowed her out. My Uncle Douglas, my years before the farm, her mother's garden and what it meant to her to keep it going. She told me once, about halfway up the ridge, that she'd come back to Karamios mostly because she'd run out of reasons not to, that she'd been telling herself for years that she was a city person, that she needed the movement and the noise, and then one day, she just couldn't feel the truth of that anymore. "I think I was afraid," she said, "that if I came back, it meant something had gone wrong. Didn't it? Maybe, but not in the way I was afraid of." I thought about my own version of that story, the automotive shop in Kamloops, the cousin who'd thought I'd be there forever, the morning I'd driven out to Douglas's property after the funeral and stood in the orchard, and felt something unfamiliar that turned out to be stillness. Sometimes the place finds you, not the other way around. "I think the wrong thing going wrong can be the best thing," I said. She looked at me sideways on the gravel road, the aspens gold above us. "That is either very wise or the most confusing sentence I've heard all week," she said. "Both, maybe." She smiled, the full version. By November, we were having dinner at one place or the other most evenings. Not every night, we were careful with that, careful not to rush the shape of things, but often enough that it started to feel like something with weight and permanence. The first time I took her to Penticton for dinner, a proper dinner, not Paulette's, we drove back along the highway in the dark, and she had her window cracked despite the cold and her elbow on the door and the radio was on low, and she turned to look at me at some point and said, "This is good, right? This is actually a good thing?" "Yeah," I said. "I think so. I just wanted to say it out loud. Say it out loud as many times as you want." She smiled at the road. "This is a good thing." "Yeah, it is." The following spring, she was still there. Not just still there, but there, in the way that means a person has stopped being somewhere temporarily and started being somewhere for real. She'd settled into the teaching job and was good at it. The way she was good at things she actually wanted to be good at. The garden behind the Hartley house came in better than it had in years because she'd been reading about soil amendment all winter and had opinions about it that she expressed with an earnestness I found almost comically endearing. The cherry preserve was in 3 stores in town and one in Penticton, which wasn't something she'd planned but it happened because people kept asking. Warren came out in April to deal with some paperwork about the estate, and the two of them spent a weekend working through it, and after he left, Sylvie came over to my place in the evening and sat on my porch and didn't say much for a while. "It's really mine now," she said eventually. "On paper and everything. How's that feel?" She thought about it. "Like I chose it," she said. "Even though I didn't really. Not at the start." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yeah," I said. "It does." She looked out at the orchard, the trees just starting to show new growth in the gray April evening. "I think I'm going to put in a few rows of lavender," she said. "Along the south fence." "Good idea. The bees would like that." "I know. I looked it up." I laughed. She did too. And it was comfortable and quiet on the porch, and the light was fading over the valley, and she was right there beside me on a Tuesday evening in spring, and I thought about how nothing about any of this had been sudden or dramatic or the way you imagine these things when you're young and you think arrival should feel like a trumpet. It felt like cedar fence posts bedded right, like an irrigation line running clean with no pressure drop, like a Honeycrisp in its 3rd year finally starting to give what you'd been hoping it would give. It felt like something that would last.